Hey all, Nathan here again, Absurd Being, and today we're going to look at Introduction to Metaphysics, which is a lecture course that Heidegger gave in 1935 at the University of Freiburg. And this is the book. Um, Definitely worth reading. It's definitely one of the I would call it a core text of later Heidegger, and in it he actually, even though the lecture course is titled Introduction to Metaphysics, he actually aims to go beyond metaphysics, and look at capital B being itself. And in doing so, he kind of goes through and compares being to four different um, concepts. He compares the becoming, seeming, thinking, and what he calls the ought. And we'll look at the way he does that, and tries to just kind of get a feel, get some insights for what this capital B being is. And he also goes through a fairly detailed. He gives an account of how this notion, his idea, his capital B being, how that has been kind of left behind, or since Plato and Aristotle has kind of gone off the rails a little bit, so that now we're in a position where no one really knows what being is anymore, and so Heidegger's in the position where he has to bring it back to our attention again. And that was what he said at the very beginning of Being and Time too. The question of being has been forgotten, and it's not even considered important. And he explains how he thinks that's happened. So we're going to look at all of that, probably over the next 4 videos. I think this is going to be about 4 videos long, but we'll see what happens. So let's get into it. The very first section we're going to look at is the fundamental question of metaphysics. So the fundamental question here, he says, in metaphysics is, why are there beings instead of nothing? And so he looks at the question itself first and says it's the broadest because it embraces everything, right? All beings. It's the deepest because it seeks the ground of beings as a whole. And it's the most originary. It's the most original kind of question you could ask. And it's not asking about a particular being. We're asking about the being. We're asking why there are beings in general. So it's not. We've just kind of going down a level, if you like. So it's the broadest, the deepest, and the most originary. Cool. The question, he says, opens up beings as a whole. So that's what metaphysics does. That's where metaphysics goes. This is the fundamental question in metaphysics. And he says it's not an arbitrary process, this opening up of beings as a whole. He calls it a happening, and an originary leap. Those words will all get, they'll have more significance later on in this, not so much in this course, but in one of the next books we look at a little bit later on. A happening, he'll use the word event to describe being, and he also talks about a leap. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It's so this question is originary. It's deep. It's the broadest. It opens up beings as a whole. It's a happening. There's an originary leap going on here, not just a logical kind of analytical progression. So we're doing something a little bit special. So he goes off on a little bit of a tangent, I think, here, talking about philosophy next. So I'll run through this quickly as well. So he says only philosophy can ask this question, this metaphysical question, why are there beings instead of nothing? Because only philosophy stands outside its own time. And he says philosophy is untimely, which might, if you've read any Nietzsche, you might recognize that, his untimely meditations, which I haven't read, so I'm not going to say anything about that. But there is that connection, and I'm sure we'll see Heidegger being influenced by Nietzsche a little bit later on as well. But so yeah, only philosophy kind of goes beyond the current paradigms and is able to look outside of those, or kind of step back from those and see what's happening, kind of from a clearer perspective. So because of that, he thinks that philosophy is the only discipline that can really address this question. However, he does say that philosophy can't directly provide a foundation for society, and it can't even make building a society easier. So in that sense, it's a little bit impractical, maybe, or not useless, but it's not it's not bankable. You can't use it like you can use other disciplines or other fields. And he does say we can't do anything with philosophy, but perhaps it can do something with us. So he sees it as it's definitely not there's no cash value to philosophy, but it's nevertheless it's important, and it's crucial, because it helps us to understand how and why we are. And that means that it lets us kind of free ourselves up for different ways of being. So unless we can actually come to some deeper understanding of being, of how and why we are, then any kind of project we undertake will always be as superficial as our understanding of ourselves is. So in that sense, it's the most important endeavor we can take up, but it doesn't have that same kind of practical, applicable sense that other disciplines might. So now metaphysics. We're going to quick look at metaphysics, and Heidegger takes us back to the Greek word phusis, which he says originally meant, and I'll quote this, what emerges from itself, the unfolding that opens itself up, the coming into appearance in such unfolding, and holding itself and persisting in appearance. In short, the emerging, abiding sway. So there's quite a bit in there, and it's not that precise, right? It's not kind of, you hear that definition, you're not like, okay, now I know what phusis means. And that's just the way Heidegger is, and it's quite poetical too, right? Poetic. And that gets to what the way Heidegger kind of thought being could be approached. It could only be reached through this. You couldn't get to it through analytical, logical concepts. You had to go through art, essentially. And so he writes kind of like that, but it's reasonably understandable if you break it down a little bit. So phusis, this original Greek word, what it meant was something that emerges from itself, so it kind of presents itself to us, an unfolding that opens itself up, coming into appearance. So you can imagine just a being that is present to us, presents itself to us, shows us what it is, and it also holds itself there. It maintains itself in that appearance so that we can grasp what it is. So that's the emerging, abiding sway. So that's cool. That's what phusis originally meant. And crucially, it didn't mean beings. It didn't mean things. It meant being, capital B being. So it was deeper than just things. It was material, kind of physical things. It was this capital B being, which is that by virtue of which beings first become and remain observable. So it was a deeper, it was what Heidegger's talking about, capital B being, not just things themselves, not just beings themselves. It's what makes those beings beings. However, it was later mistranslated as beings, things, physical things. And so the word metaphysics, metaphysica, I'm not sure how you say that, metaphysica, is an attempt then, meta meaning beyond or meaning beyond, is an attempt to get to beings as a whole by going beyond beings, by going metaphysics, metaphysis. And hence the fundamental question of metaphysics. Why are there beings instead of nothing? An attempt to get to beings as a whole, what explains beings by going beyond individual beings. So that's pretty tidy. And Heidegger gives a criticism here, however, of metaphysics. And he says it actually never gets beyond beings. Because beings as a whole is still beings. It still refers to beings and starts from beings. So there's no way for it to kind of get outside of that. This whole question of metaphysics, why are there beings instead of nothing, it's already starting with beings, and it never gets it, because of that it can't get beyond them. Hence, he says the question of this lecture course is actually going beyond metaphysics, metaphysics, if you like, to being itself, capital B being, which he says here, which he describes here as the disclosedness of capital B being. And I'm just going to keep saying that. I mean, I'll just keep using the term capital B being to mean this deeper sense of being. And I will keep using the word beings to mean entities, things, physical things. Not just physical things actually, but yeah. So that's why it's good to keep the language. It's not just physical things. It's anything that we can kind of make an object for ourselves, that can become an object for us, that is a being, small b being. So we're kind of dancing between these ambiguous, and sometimes it's not clear. It's not a good way. It's not a clear way to speak, but it's the way Heidegger talks and the way he writes. And I think it's important that we adopt his terms in order to really understand what he's getting at. So anyway, capital B being itself. So the next question he asked is, can we get rid of this part of the last part of this question? So the question, why are there beings instead of nothing? Can we just get rid of that instead of nothing? Why can't we just say, why are there beings? Wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't that be clearer? Well, instead of nothing, so we've got this idea of nothing again, which we've looked at in prior videos. And he goes into a little bit, which I will also run through, but it's basically the same thing. He says logic or science tells us we can't talk of nothing, because as soon as we try and talk about it, we turn it into something. But the resolution is not that we can't talk about nothing, but that science, logic, can't talk about nothing. So we can get there, just not through science or logic. not through that analytic reasoning, because this is exactly where it's limited. We've talked about that quite a lot, so I won't go into that in too much detail. So if we just ask why are there beings at all, and leave out that instead of nothing, then we're starting from beings and trying to move to the ground of them, moving to their what makes them possible, right? So why are there beings? We're trying to get to a reason for beings, but we're starting from beings and trying to just kind of work our way up the ontological food chain, if you like, to get to some kind of higher being. The problem with that, though, is that that question then it presupposes beings, and starting from beings, it just takes them as already established. We're not questioning beings themselves. We're just starting. We're already starting with beings and just trying to ask, where do they come from? How do they come to be? But we haven't really questioned beings as they are. All we've done is like I say, trying to move up the food chain, move up the ontological food chain somewhere. Whereas the original question, why are there beings instead of nothing, that doesn't presuppose beings. Rather, it holds them out as wavering into not being and nothing. So in that sense, it's a more originary kind of questioning of being, because we've got why are there beings instead of nothing. Immediately we're throwing the existence of those beings into question. So there could be nothing instead of beings, instead of those beings. Why is there not nothing? So now it's a deeper questioning, because we're not presupposing those beings. We're not just starting from, well, beings exist, why do they exist? Instead we're saying beings exist, but they might not have existed. I mean, it could be nothing. So why do they exist in the first place? So it's a more fundamental questioning of beings. And basically what it means is if we try and cut out that the part the section that refers to nothing instead of nothing in that original question, then that would just be an attempt to provide a present at hand ground for something present at hand. That is to say, we're just looking for another being, a being at a different rung on that ontological ladder. However, what we really want is the ground of beings as overcoming nothing. We want to really ask the question of beings themselves, not just look for another being higher up that food chain. And basically what we're saying there is that we're including possibility, the possibility of not being, and we're adding that, or including that in our questioning. So he moves into a discussion of the relation between being and being, small b being and capital B being. So beings are things, and capital B being is that which makes them beings. Okay, basically. The problem, however, with interrogating beings in regard to their capital B being is that we never see this capital B being in beings. We never see this being in things. All we see are the things. Plus, the being of beings is different for everybody. Now, Heidegger's example is the building in which he's giving this lecture. It's different. It's it's a different thing for people outside on the street as opposed to the students inside listening to the lecture, right? So its being is dependent on, its being is different for different people, depending on how it appears to them and what, if I bring in an old being in time term, the referential totality of the beings in that person's circumspectful taking care. So there's that as well, and there's even a deeper problem in that, and this now it does start to get a little bit complicated. We actually want to go beyond the being of beings to capital B, being in regard to its ground. Being in regard to its ground. So this new question Heidegger's raising here is, how does it stand with being? Capital B, being. So it's not quite the case that there are three kinds of beings, but it almost is. You've got the beings, which are things. Then you've got this capital B being, which is Heidegger will later call this beingness, the being of beings, and that's that's just that capital B being, what it is for what makes beings, what makes them beings in the first place. But what we're really after is just how it stands with capital B being itself, completely divorced from those beings. We don't want to try and get into capital B being through beings. We want to just address and understand this capital B being itself, being in regard to its ground. And so again, that's another problem that exists if we're trying to go through beings to get to this deeper capital B being, where we're kind of running aground a little bit, and that all we're getting to is the capital B being of beings. We're getting to what makes beings beings, but we're doing it in such a way that there's still that connecting thread to those beings. And what Heidegger's ultimate aim is to just come to this understanding of capital B being itself. So so hopefully that makes sense. I know there are a lot of beings in that, and it might even help later on. We'll talk about in another video. We'll talk about, or Heidegger talks about the guiding question, which is the being of beings, and the basic question, which is the ground of the being of beings. So, and he kind of divides. So you've got like things, and then you've got this guiding question, the being of beings, which is a metaphysical question, and then you've got this basic question, which is the ground of that being itself. So that's hopefully that it makes it a little bit clearer. Capital B being is always referring to this being of beings, but ultimately we want to get beyond that that connection with things themselves to an understanding of how it stands with capital B being. And he says that this deeper question, is a repetition and retrieval of the inception of our Dasein in order to transform it into another inception. And this is a new, more original beginning, a happening that grounds history anew. Lots of interesting terms in there that we haven't seen before. Repetition, which is a link back to Kierkegaard. He talks about inception of our Dasein. We'll see that coming up later as well. And grounding history, and we'll talk about history in a moment. But anyway, I'll just leave that as it is, and we'll move on. So this being, in this new deeper question, how does it stand with being, this capital B being? The first thing he says about it is it's not a more general, universal, and therefore empty concept. That is what that is what ontology is. Ontology is that kind of branch of philosophy, and which he talked about a lot in Being and Time. But it's a branch that kind of categorizes, and it's kind of an analytical approach to being. I think Heidegger sees it like that anyway, and that's not what Heidegger's after here. It's not the way he wants to go. So he abandons the use of this word ontology, and he'll criticize it later as well. So this isn't what Heidegger's up to here. Is not ontology. He says ontology is like this kind of a way of building a framework, if you like, maybe, or a categorization, a structure within which we can understand beings. And that's not what Heidegger's about. So he's not composing an ontology. He says he's restoring the historical Dasein of human beings. So there's that word again, history. So what does this mean? Basically, it doesn't mean the past. So he's not talking about what's past. That kind of history, which I think he calls the science of history, and I think it was translated as historiology in Being and Time, I think, as opposed to the more original historicity, I think was the word we used there. So we're just going to use history here, but this is not what's past, and that kind of history, the past, presupposes Heidegger's more original understanding of history, which we're talking about here. This is, and I'll quote it for you, history as happening is determined from the future, takes over what has been, and acts and endures its way through the present. So the completely different from what we normally mean by history, right? It encompasses all three tenses, the past, present, and future. And it's the way I kind of think about it is it's more like an era. It's more like an authentic engagement with beings based on this deeper understanding of capital B being. So when you engage, when you understand capital B being, when you've come to a fuller kind of appreciation of that, then you can engage with beings in a more authentic and original manner. And at that point, then you begin what Heidegger calls history. Then history begins. So the way I kind of think about it is it's a little bit like an era. It's a period where capital B being has been grasped and assimilated, and we're engaging kind of authentically with the world. So this question, this new question that Heidegger's asking about how it stands with capital B being, is historical because it opens up the happening of Dasein in its essential relations to beings as such and as a whole, which is basically just what I said. So how is the question regarding being, how is this not meaningless, given all that we've talked about and how we've kind of drifted and wandered and stumbled around a little bit? How is this not an empty kind of term? Heidegger calls it vapor. How is it not mere vapor? Well, Heidegger says that he thinks the spiritual world of his time, so this is late 30s, or mid 30s, um, he says the spiritual world of his time is entering a dark period. He calls it a disempowering of the spirit. Um, and there is a political dimension to this too. Actually, he talks about Russia and the US kind of squeezing Europe a little bit, and yeah. Anyway, he sees this disempowering of the spirit, and one thing he mentions is the idea that there's no superiority anymore. The idea of rank has kind of been cast aside, and now it's all about the mediocrity, just being good enough, and no one kind of excelling. There being no one better than anyone else. Everybody's kind of the same. This leveling down, which is a really Nietzschean thing to say, right? So there's that. I don't want to dwell too much on that. I mean, I don't want to read too much into that. Whether he was, arguing for in the same kind of vein as Nietzsche, I would guess not. But he's definitely rebelling against this idea of and he called it in Being in Time, right? Leveling down, this kind of no one excelling, and no one's better than anyone else, and everybody's just as good as everybody else in their own way, or there is no better or worse, and that kind of thing. So you can kind of read it as him rallying against that, and he gives 4 ways in which the spirit, he's calling it, the spirit has been diminished, the spirit of his age. And the first is that spirit has become synonymous with intelligence. So this is a quote, cleverness in the examination, calculation, and observation of given things. So spirit, this kind of and obviously it goes without saying that Heidegger's not talking about a soul or anything here, right? But spirit, like just the what would be a good way to put it? Just the essence. Again, it's kind of pseudo religious, right? Essence of human, that the inner force or power or strength, something like that. It's not, but this is definitely not a religious or metaphysical, new agey kind of idea. He's just talking about his Dasein, really, I guess. So that this spirit's been reduced to intelligence, which is again that analytical, logical, calculating mindset, rather than an authentic, original kind of engagement with the world. So spirit has been reduced to a tool. That's the second point he notes. Something we use to an instrument we kind of make use of to further some situation or to improve our lot in some way. And the powers of spiritual happening, by which he means things like poetry, state creation, he says, and religion, things like that. I guess like the ways that our spirit, again using that word, is manifest in the world. These kinds of things are consciously cultivated and planned. Again, I think that's just, he's pointing out that there's this analytical, analyzing, intellectual kind of approach to this scientific approach to what he thinks ought to be a more if I wanted to use a metaphor, I guess, from the heart rather than from the brain. And that's kind of what I think Heidegger's getting at there. And the fourth the fourth point is that spirit is then a showpiece that which just becomes trotted out for the public, so it loses its meaning, its intrinsic meaning, its specialness. Well, here's the definition of spirit. Well, after all of that umming and ahhing, it's an originally attuned, knowing resolution to the essence of being, the empowering of the powers of beings as such and as a whole, which probably doesn't make things that much clearer, but it's not bad, I guess. An attuned resolution to the essence of capital B, being. So we've got that connection again. So the way to reawaken the spirit and ground history anew is through this authentic questioning of being, which is what Heidegger's engaged in here. And this most important question then, this question of capital B, being, has been reduced to a mere word. And one reason he gives for this is the language has become used up and abused. And that is what we're going to talk about in the next video when we look at the grammar and etymology of the word being. Until then, hopefully that's helped somebody, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you. Thanks for listening. See you.